The candle flickers in the corner of a medieval hall. Outside, the wind moves through narrow streets where most of the buildings lean against one another for support. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marks the hour. Life in the Middle Ages moved to rhythms we've almost forgotten: seasons, harvests, holy days, and the ever-present awareness that time itself was precious in ways we struggle to understand today. We've all heard the numbers. Medieval people died at 30. Life was brutal, short, and nasty. The past was a place where survival itself seemed like a lottery, where disease and violence cut down everyone before they could see their hair turn gray. But like so many things we think we know about history, the truth is far more interesting than the myth. The story of medieval life expectancy isn't really about how long people lived. It's about who survived, what killed them, and what those numbers actually mean when we look closer. Tonight, we're going to walk through that medieval world and understand what life and death really looked like. Not through statistics alone, but through the lives of real people, peasants and nobles, children and elders, the lucky and the unfortunate. We'll see why those famous numbers tell only part of the story, and discover that medieval people weren't quite as doomed as we've been led to believe. So settle in. Let our voice be a companion as we journey back to a world of stone walls and thatched roofs, of herbs and prayers, of communities that understood mortality in ways both harder and perhaps wiser than our own. The number appears in textbooks, documentaries, and casual conversations with an air of certainty. Medieval life expectancy was somewhere between 30 and 35 years. It's repeated so often that it feels like established fact, an indictment of a brutal age when life was cheap and death came early. But this number, for all its authority, conceals more than it reveals. Understanding what it actually means, and what it doesn't, is the first step in seeing the medieval world clearly. Life expectancy is a statistical average, and like all averages, it can mislead. Imagine a classroom where 5 students score 90% on a test and 5 students score 10%. The average is 50%, but that number describes no one's actual experience. Medieval life expectancy works the same way. It's an average that includes everyone who died, from the infant who lived 3 days to the merchant who saw 70 winters. And in the Middle Ages, those extremes were profound. The number is dragged down, often dramatically, by infant and child mortality. In many medieval communities, somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before reaching the age of 5. This wasn't universal. Rates varied by region, class, and era, but childhood was undeniably dangerous. Diseases we now prevent with simple vaccinations swept through villages. Accidents happened. Malnutrition weakened small bodies. When you calculate life expectancy at birth and include all those children who never saw their 6th birthday, the average plummets. But here's what that average obscures: if you survived childhood, your prospects changed dramatically. A person who reached adulthood in medieval Europe had a reasonable chance of living into their 50s, 60s, or even beyond. They wouldn't have the medical interventions we take for granted, certainly, but they also weren't universally struck down in their 30s. The medieval world was full of older people, grandparents, master craftsmen, village elders, experienced farmers who'd seen decades of harvests. We can see this in the records that survive. Manorial rolls, tax documents, and guild records mention people well into their later years. Wills were written by men and women who'd accumulated property and wisdom over long lives. Skeletal remains tell stories too. Archaeologists regularly find medieval burials of individuals who lived to 50, 60, 70, and occasionally beyond. These weren't rare unicorns. They were a normal, if perhaps not majority, part of the demographic landscape. The class divide matters here as well. A wealthy noble had access to better nutrition, relative safety from physical labor's worst dangers, and often slightly better medical care, though better is a relative term in a world without antibiotics. A peasant faced harder physical conditions, but even among the peasant class, reaching old age was far from impossible. Village records show elderly farmers, aged midwives, grandmothers who helped raise multiple generations. They existed. They mattered. But the average erases them, lumping them together with all those lost children and creating an illusion of universal early death. It's worth considering why this myth persists. Perhaps it's comforting in a strange way to believe we've progressed so far beyond our ancestors, that we've conquered something they couldn't. Or perhaps it's simply easier to teach a single number than to explain the complex reality beneath it. Whatever the reason, the 30-year life expectancy has become shorthand for medieval suffering, a way of dismissing an entire era as primitive and doomed. But people in the Middle Ages didn't experience their lives as statistics. They knew elderly relatives. They saw people grow old. A 40-year-old wasn't considered ancient, teetering on the edge of natural limits. They were middle-aged, perhaps hoping for another 20 or 30 years if fortune smiled. The poet Dante began writing the Divine Comedy in his 40s and lived to 56. Chaucer was writing into his 50s. These weren't superhuman outliers. They were people who'd made it past the dangerous early years and then lived lives not entirely dissimilar in length to what we might expect today, if somewhat shorter on average. The misleading average also affects how we think about medieval society's structure. If everyone died at 30, how did knowledge accumulate? How did crafts requiring decades of practice survive? How did anyone become wise, experienced, or respected for their long service? The answer is simple: they lived long enough. The blacksmith who trained apprentices had been working for 30 years. The woman who served as village healer had accumulated knowledge across decades. The lord who managed an estate had learned from his father, who'd learned from his father, creating chains of experience that stretched back generations. So when we say medieval life expectancy was 30 to 35 years, we're not exactly wrong, but we're not exactly right either. We're stating a mathematical truth that obscures a human one. Yes, the average was low. But behind that average were millions of individual lives, many of them cut short in infancy, many others stretching into a long and experienced old age. The Middle Ages had plenty of elderly people. They just had to survive childhood first. Understanding this changes how we see everything else about medieval life. It means communities weren't populated solely by young people. It means experience and accumulated wisdom had value and time to develop. It means that when we look at a medieval village, we should imagine not just young adults struggling to survive, but a full spectrum of ages, including gray-haired men and women who'd seen more years than we might expect. The number, in the end, is real. But reality is always more complicated than any single number can capture. A medieval birth was a threshold moment, wrapped in prayer and preparation. Childbirth itself carried risks we've almost forgotten. Infection, hemorrhage, complications we now manage routinely could turn fatal without warning. If both mother and child survived the birth, they'd crossed the first barrier. But ahead lay years of vulnerability that would test the infant's constitution against a world full of invisible dangers. The first year was the most precarious. Infants faced threats from every direction. Infectious diseases, many of them now preventable, could spread rapidly through communities. Diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated water or food took a terrible toll. Respiratory infections flourished, especially in crowded conditions or during cold winters when families huddled together for warmth. An infant's immune system, still developing, struggled against pathogens that an adult body might shrug off. Nutrition played a crucial role. Breastfeeding, when possible, provided some protection. Mother's milk contained antibodies and was safer than alternatives. But not all mothers could breastfeed. Some died in childbirth. Some couldn't produce enough milk. Wet nurses served wealthy families, but poorer families might resort to feeding infants with animal milk or pap, a mixture of bread and water or milk, which lacked proper nutrients and could carry disease. A malnourished infant had fewer defenses against illness. As children grew beyond infancy, different dangers emerged. Toddlers exploring their world faced accidents, falls, burns from open fires, drowning in wells or streams. In agricultural communities, children were often around large animals and sharp tools. They lived in houses with open flames for cooking and heating. The architecture itself could be hazardous: steep stairs, unguarded openings, roofs that might collapse. Parents did their best, but constant supervision wasn't always possible when there was work to be done. Childhood diseases that we now vaccinate against ran their natural course through medieval populations. Measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, diphtheria, each made its rounds. Some children developed immunity and survived. Others didn't. These diseases often clustered, hitting communities in waves. A single epidemic might claim multiple children from the same family, leaving parents to bury sons and daughters in quick succession. Social class created different experiences of childhood risk. A noble child had access to better nutrition, more meat, more variety, more calories overall. They lived in larger spaces, which might reduce disease transmission slightly. If they fell ill, physicians might be summoned, though medical knowledge of the era meant this didn't always help. But they also faced their own particular risks, including being sent away young for fostering or education, separating them from parental protection. Peasant children often worked from a young age, contributing to household survival. By 5 or 6, a child might help with simple tasks, watching younger siblings, herding geese, gathering firewood. By 10, they were doing real labor. This early work brought exposure to agricultural accidents and fatigue that could weaken resistance to disease. But it also meant integration into community life. Multiple adults who might notice if a child seemed unwell. The church marked a child's progress through rituals that also acknowledged vulnerability. Baptism happened quickly after birth, ensuring the infant's soul was secured should death come soon. Children who died were mourned, but with a fatalism born of frequency. Parents loved their children. Medieval letters and records make this clear, but they also knew that not all children would survive to adulthood. Some historians once suggested medieval parents remained emotionally distant to protect themselves, but this appears to be false. Grief over lost children echoes through medieval texts. They loved and they lost, and they found ways to continue. Wealthier families sometimes recorded their children in account books or family chronicles, giving us glimpses of individual lives. We read of parents consulting physicians, making pilgrimages to saints' shrines seeking intercession, trying folk remedies. They weren't passive. They fought for their children's survival with the tools they had. When a child died, they mourned. When a child thrived, they gave thanks. Folk practices and superstitions surrounded childhood because the stakes were so high. Charms were placed in cradles. Certain prayers were recited. Some families consulted wise women who knew healing herbs. Whether these practices helped medically is debatable, but they gave parents a sense of agency, something to do besides wait and hope. In a world where childhood death was common, any ritual that offered protection held value. The children who survived this gauntlet emerged into later childhood with constitutions that had proved resilient. They'd been exposed to many diseases and developed some immunity. They'd learned to navigate their environment's dangers. By the time they reached 10 or 12, their chances of reaching adulthood had increased substantially. The worst was, statistically speaking, behind them. This is why medieval life expectancy changes so dramatically when calculated from age 5 rather than birth. A 5-year-old in medieval Europe might expect to live into their 50s. They'd proven their survival capacity. The average that includes all the infants and toddlers who died before 5 doesn't reflect their prospects anymore. They'd made it through the gauntlet. Understanding this helps explain medieval attitudes toward childhood. Children were valued, but they were also understood to be vulnerable. The community invested in children who showed promise of surviving. Education, training, inheritance planning, these things happened increasingly as a child grew older and their survival seemed more assured. It wasn't cruelty, It was realistic assessment in a world where resources were limited and loss was frequent. The medieval parent lived with a tension we've largely escaped, loving fully while knowing that death might come at any moment. They celebrated children who thrived. They mourned those who didn't. And they raised the survivors in communities that understood both the preciousness and the fragility of young life. The children who made it through became the adults who would repeat the cycle, hoping their own children might also survive to continue the line. Surviving childhood was an achievement, but adulthood brought its own collection of dangers. The medieval world demanded physical labor from most of its inhabitants, and that work carried risks that accumulated over years until they sometimes overwhelmed even a strong constitution. To understand medieval life expectancy, we need to understand medieval work, the daily, grinding, necessary efforts that kept society functioning. For the majority of medieval Europeans who worked the land, farming meant constant physical exertion. Plowing fields behind oxen or horses, wielding heavy tools, harvesting grain with scythes and sickles, threshing wheat, every stage required strength and endurance. The work was seasonal, with periods of intense activity at planting and harvest times. During these crucial weeks, farmers worked from dawn until dark, racing against weather and the calendar. Bodies were pushed hard, and accidents happened. Agricultural accidents took many forms. A plow could strike a hidden rock and buck backward, injuring the farmer. Scythes and sickles were sharp enough to do serious damage if they slipped. Animals could kick or trample. Trees being felled for firewood might fall unpredictably. Someone carrying a heavy load might fall and break a bone. These weren't daily occurrences for any individual, but across a community of hundreds or thousands, such accidents happened regularly. The consequences of injury were often more severe than the injury itself. A broken leg that would inconvenience us for weeks could prove fatal in a world without sterile operating rooms. Infection was the great killer. Even a minor cut could become infected, and without antibiotics, infection could spread until it poisoned the blood or required amputation of a limb, itself a dangerous procedure. A person who couldn't work also couldn't eat, or at least couldn't earn their living, creating a cascade of problems. Other occupations had their own particular hazards. Miners worked in dark, unstable underground spaces where cave-ins could bury workers alive and where the air itself might be toxic or oxygen depleted. Blacksmiths and metalworkers faced burns from forges, injuries from hammering, and long-term effects from breathing metal fumes. Construction workers building churches and castles worked at heights without modern safety equipment, with predictable results when someone lost their footing. Even occupations that seemed safer carried risks. Merchants traveled roads that might harbor bandits. They crossed seas where storms could sink ships. They entered foreign cities where disease might be epidemic. Clergy seemed protected by their role, but they also tended the sick during disease outbreaks, exposing themselves deliberately. Monks and nuns lived in close quarters where respiratory diseases spread easily. No occupation was truly safe. Women's work had its own dangers. Childbirth, as mentioned, carried significant risk, and many women went through pregnancy and childbirth multiple times. Between pregnancies, they managed households, which meant cooking over open fires, drawing water from wells, preserving food, making clothing, and often contributing to agricultural work or craft production. Burns, falls, and repetitive strain injuries affected women just as they did men. The cumulative effect of medieval work was wear on the body. Skeletal remains show arthritis, spinal damage, and signs of repeated stress injuries. People worked through pain because stopping meant not eating. They adapted as they could. An artisan with damaged hands might supervise apprentices. A farmer with a bad back might focus on less strenuous tasks. But the body's deterioration was often progressive. Nutrition played a crucial role in determining how well someone withstood the demands of work. A well-fed laborer recovered better from exertion and injury. A malnourished person might develop the medieval disease called green sickness, anemia resulting from inadequate iron in the diet. They'd feel perpetually weak, more vulnerable to disease, less able to heal from injury. Class differences in diet translated directly into differences in physical resilience. Yet people adapted remarkably well. Human bodies are tough, and medieval people's bodies were conditioned from childhood to physical labor. They developed strong muscles and cardiovascular fitness that many of us would envy. A farmer walking behind a plow all day had the kind of endurance that comes only from years of conditioning. They might ache, but they functioned. Their work was hard, but it wasn't beyond human capacity, obviously, since millions performed it year after year. Communities also developed systems of support for when individuals couldn't work. Families took care of injured or ill members. Guilds in towns sometimes maintained funds to support members who'd fallen on hard times. The church preached charity and maintained hospitals, though hospital, in the medieval sense, often meant a place for rest and food rather than medical treatment. These safety nets were imperfect and often inadequate, but they existed. The medieval work year also included rest periods. Sundays and religious feast days meant no labor. By some estimates, medieval people had more days off than modern workers. This wasn't pure generosity. It was religious obligation, but it also gave bodies time to recover. The agricultural calendar had slower periods too, winter months when there was less field work, giving farmers a chance to repair buildings, make tools, and rest somewhat. Some occupations allowed for longevity. A successful merchant might accumulate enough wealth to hire others for the most dangerous work. A master craftsman could shift towards supervisory roles as their body aged. A village-wise woman's knowledge became more valuable as she aged, compensating for any decline in physical capacity. Medieval society had roles for the elderly, ways for experienced people to contribute without the physical demands of youth. But for many, the working years took their toll. By the time someone reached their 40s or 50s, a lifetime of labor showed. If they were lucky and had avoided serious accident or disease, they might continue working at a reduced pace. If they weren't lucky, they might find themselves dependent on family or charity, their productive years behind them. The medieval world didn't have retirement in our sense, but it understood that bodies wore out, and made some accommodation for this reality. Work was survival. It was also identity, community, and purpose. Medieval people took pride in their crafts and their labor. They understood they were contributing to something larger than themselves. And they accepted that the work would shape and eventually wear down their bodies. It was the price of living, the cost of eating, and the way things had always been. They did what needed doing, for as long as their bodies allowed. Step into a medieval town on market day and your senses would be overwhelmed. The smell of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and rotting refuse would hit you immediately. The streets, often unpaved, turned to mud when it rained. People and animals shared the same spaces. Waste disposal meant throwing refuse into the street or into rivers that also provided drinking water. To modern eyes, it would look unsanitary, even dangerous. And it was. But medieval people didn't understand disease the way we do, and so they lived with conditions that inadvertently spread illness with brutal efficiency. The theory of disease that dominated medieval thought came from ancient Greek physicians, particularly Galen. They believed illness resulted from an imbalance in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease came from within, from personal constitution and lifestyle, not from invisible organisms passing between people. This meant that while medieval people noticed disease spread through communities, they didn't understand the mechanism. They attributed it to corrupted air, divine punishment, or astrological influences. Without understanding contagion, people couldn't effectively prevent disease transmission. They didn't know to wash hands before preparing food. They didn't understand that water contaminated with human waste could sicken anyone who drank it. They didn't realize that fleas on rats could carry plague, or that mosquitoes could spread disease, or that tuberculosis passed through the air between people living in close quarters. They did their best with the knowledge they had, but their best wasn't enough. Waterborne diseases caused constant low-level mortality. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera spread through contaminated water supplies. Medieval people often preferred ale or wine to water, which accidentally protected them somewhat since the brewing process involved boiling water, killing pathogens. But ale was expensive, and many people drank water anyway. Urban areas with higher population density saw more waterborne illness. Rural communities with cleaner water sources fared somewhat better. Respiratory diseases flourished in the close quarters of medieval life. Tuberculosis, which we now call TB, was endemic. It spread easily in crowded households where multiple people shared sleeping spaces and air. The disease could linger for years, slowly weakening its victims. Influenza swept through periodically in epidemics. Pneumonia struck the young, the old, and anyone weakened by other illness or hardship. In winter, when people stayed indoors around fires, respiratory diseases had ideal conditions to spread. Skin diseases and infections were common. Without antibiotics, even minor wounds could become infected. Leprosy, though less common than popular imagination suggests, did affect medieval Europe. People with leprosy were often isolated in leprosaria, ostracized from society. Other skin conditions, caused by parasites, fungi, or bacteria, made life uncomfortable and could lead to secondary infections. Lice and fleas were nearly universal companions, spreading typhus and other diseases. Childhood diseases ran their course without vaccination. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, and diphtheria circulated through communities in waves. Most adults had survived these diseases as children and gained immunity, but each new generation had to face them afresh. When an epidemic struck, it hit children hardest, sometimes claiming multiple siblings from a single family in quick succession. Parents could only nurse their children through illness and pray they'd survive. Plague deserves special mention, though it wasn't a constant presence throughout the medieval period. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the population over the next few years. Subsequent outbreaks occurred periodically, though never quite as devastating as that initial wave. Plague was terrifying. It struck suddenly, killed quickly, and no one understood how to stop it. Communities tried quarantine, flight, and prayer. Sometimes these helped, sometimes they didn't. Plague reshaped medieval society, but it was an extraordinary event, not the normal baseline of medieval disease. Medical treatment existed, but its effectiveness varied. Physicians trained at universities learned Galenic theory and treated illness by trying to restore humoral balance through bloodletting, purges, and special diets. Surgeons, considered less prestigious, handled wounds, amputations, and other physical interventions. Barber surgeons performed minor procedures. And folk healers, especially women with knowledge of medicinal herbs, provided care in communities that couldn't afford university-trained physicians. Some herbal remedies actually worked. Willow bark, which contains a compound related to aspirin, helped with pain and fever. Honey, with its antibacterial properties, worked reasonably well for treating wounds. Various herbs had real if modest effects. But many treatments ranged from useless to actively harmful. Bloodletting weakened patients who needed strength. Some cures were based more on symbolism or magical thinking than on any therapeutic value. Medieval medicine was a mix of practical wisdom and ineffective theory. Religious responses to disease were ubiquitous. Illness might be interpreted as divine punishment for sin, which meant repentance and prayer were appropriate responses. Saints were invoked for protection or healing: Saint Sebastian for plague, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Lucy for eye problems. Pilgrimages to shrines sought miraculous cures. Holy relics were believed to have healing powers. Whether through placebo effect, spontaneous remission, or simple hopes sustaining someone through illness, some people did recover after religious interventions, reinforcing faith in their efficacy. Hospitals existed, though they were different from modern hospitals. Operated by religious orders, they provided beds, food, and rest for the sick and for travelers. Some had attached physicians or surgeons. They practiced basic sanitation, clean linens, separation of patients, removal of waste. The care was more supportive than curative, but in a world where many sick people couldn't rest or eat properly, this basic support helped some survive. Hospitals were acts of charity, fulfilling religious obligations to care for the suffering. Despite all this disease, many people survived. Human immune systems are remarkably adaptable. Someone who survived childhood diseases gained immunity. Someone who survived plague became resistant to future outbreaks. Bodies learned to coexist with various parasites and infections, maintaining a sort of détente that allowed functioning if not perfect health. Medieval people often lived with conditions we'd consider intolerable, but they managed. The acceptance of disease as part of life shaped medieval culture. Death was present, acknowledged in art and literature. Churches displayed memento mori, reminders of mortality. People wrote wills and arranged their spiritual affairs while still healthy, knowing sudden death could come at any time. This wasn't morbid, it was realistic. Living with disease meant living with the possibility of death, and medieval people developed cultural and spiritual resources for coping with this reality. The medieval world held danger beyond disease and labor's slow attrition. Violence threaded through society at every level, from petty disputes that turned fatal to organized warfare that killed by the thousands. Accidents, too, claimed lives with a frequency that might surprise us, used as we are to safety regulations and warning labels. To understand how long medieval people lived, we must understand how many died suddenly, through violence or misfortune. At the personal level, violence flared in taverns, markets, and streets. Medieval people carried knives as everyday tools, useful for eating, working, and cutting anything that needed cutting. But a tool is also a weapon. Disputes over money, honor, romantic jealousy, or simple drunken anger could escalate quickly when everyone was armed. A push, a punch, a knife drawn in anger, and suddenly someone lay bleeding in the street. Many medieval towns show homicide rates that would shock modern sensibilities, especially in rougher neighborhoods or during festival times when drink flowed freely. The justice system addressed violence, but imperfectly. Serious crimes might be punished by execution, amputation, or mutilation. Lesser offenses brought fines or public humiliation. But enforcement depended on witnesses coming forward, authorities caring enough to pursue the case, and the perpetrator being caught. Many killings went unpunished, especially if the victim was poor or if the killer had powerful friends. Self-defense was recognized, but proving it wasn't always easy. Blood feuds between families or clans could span generations in some regions. An insult or injury demanded revenge, which prompted counter-revenge, creating cycles of violence that killed men from both families over decades. Communities tried various mechanisms to break these cycles: legal settlements, church mediation, arranged marriages to unite feuding families. But the obligation to avenge one's kin ran deep in many cultures. Young men died in vendettas their grandfathers had started. Warfare was a more organized form of violence, but no less deadly. The medieval period saw constant warfare between kingdoms, duchies, and city-states. Armies clashed in pitched battles where thousands could die in a single day. Sieges starved defenders until they surrendered or died. Raids and counter-raids across borders killed soldiers and civilians alike. For the common soldier, war meant wielding weapons in close combat, and surviving depended on skill, luck, and the quality of one's armor. Battle wounds were often fatal even if not immediately so. A sword cut or arrow wound could become infected. Internal injuries might bleed internally or cause organ failure. Field medicine was primitive. Surgeons could amputate crushed limbs or sew up wounds, but infection remained a deadly threat. Many soldiers who survived battle died days or weeks later from their injuries. Disease, too, ravaged armies camped together, spreading through poor sanitation and close quarters. Civilians died in warfare as well. Armies lived off the land they moved through, confiscating food and supplies, sometimes burning fields to deny them to enemies. Civilians who resisted might be killed. Women faced sexual violence. Towns that fell to siege might be sacked, with inhabitants killed or sold into slavery. The chevauchée, a military strategy of deliberate raiding to destroy enemy territory's economic base, meant widespread civilian suffering. War's consequences extended far beyond battlefields. Not all violence was interpersonal or military. Judicial execution was public and often brutal. Criminals might be hanged, beheaded, burned, or subjected to other forms of execution intended to deter crime and satisfy justice. The innocent sometimes died alongside the guilty. False accusations, forced confessions under torture, or simple mistakes meant that not everyone executed was actually guilty. Public executions drew crowds, serving as entertainment and warning both. Accidents, meanwhile, claimed lives with steady regularity. Construction accidents killed workers building cathedrals and castles. Fires consumed wooden houses, sometimes spreading to destroy entire neighborhoods. People drowned in rivers, wells, and while traveling by boat. Falls from heights, kicks from animals, crushing injuries from carts or mill wheels. Medieval records document an array of accidental deaths that sound almost absurd in their variety until we remember how many ways life could go wrong without modern safety measures. Children faced particular risk of accidental death. They drowned in streams, fell into fires, wandered too close to wells or cliffs. Parents did their best, but constant supervision wasn't always possible, especially in families where adults had to work. Older children watched younger siblings, but children guarding children meant accidents happened. The architectural environment, stairs without railings, floors with gaps, roofs with precarious footing, created dangers our child-proofed homes have eliminated. Poisoning, both accidental and intentional, occurred more often than we might guess. Food spoilage could produce toxins. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, caused ergotism, which led to convulsions, gangrene, and death. Contaminated water carried more than just disease. Intentional poisoning was harder to detect and prosecute in an age without forensic science, making it an occasional method of murder, though probably less common than popular fiction suggests. Travel itself was dangerous. Roads were poor, often little more than muddy tracks. Bridges might be poorly maintained or missing entirely, requiring fords that could turn treacherous when rivers ran high. Bandits haunted less traveled routes. Weather could turn fatal for travelers caught unprepared. Ships sank in storms. Pilgrims seeking holy sites faced all these dangers plus the perils of foreign lands where they didn't speak the language or know the customs. Wild animals, though less of a threat than in earlier periods, still posed some danger. Wolves preyed on livestock and occasionally on lone travelers. Bears lived in forests that people passed through. Even domestic animals could kill. Horses could throw and trample riders, bulls could gore handlers, dogs could turn vicious. Medieval people lived much closer to animals than most of us do, which meant more opportunity for fatal encounters. Natural disasters struck without warning. Earthquakes damaged buildings, sometimes burying inhabitants. Floods swamped low-lying areas. Avalanches in mountain regions swept away villages. Storms destroyed crops and killed people caught outside. While individually rare, these events punctuated medieval life, reminders that nature could be violently indifferent to human survival. The cumulative effect of all this violence and accident was a steady loss of life across all age groups. A young man might die in battle or in a tavern brawl. A woman might die when her house caught fire. A child might drown in a well. An elderly person might suffer a fatal fall. These deaths weren't the norm. Most people died of disease or old age, but they were common enough that everyone knew someone who died suddenly, violently, or accidentally. Medieval people responded to this danger with a mix of caution and fatalism. They took what precautions they could, bolting doors at night, traveling in groups, avoiding known dangerous areas. But they also accepted that some things couldn't be prevented. Death could come at any moment, through violence or accident, and this awareness colored medieval spirituality. Life was precious because it was fragile. Each day was a gift that might be the last. This wasn't pessimism but realism, and it shaped how people thought about mortality and meaning. The elderly existed in the Middle Ages. We need to state this explicitly because the myth of 30-year life expectancy has convinced many people otherwise. Every medieval community had its older members, gray-haired men and women who'd accumulated decades of experience and memory. They weren't numerous, perhaps, but they weren't vanishingly rare either. Understanding medieval old age means understanding both how people reached it and what life looked like once they did. First, let's define terms. Elderly, in the medieval context, might mean something different than today. A person in their 50s or 60s was certainly considered old, having lived longer than many of their generation. Some medical texts of the era suggested 7-year increments: youth until 21, young adulthood until 35, maturity until 49, old age until 70, and decrepitude beyond that. These were theoretical constructs, but they suggest medieval people recognized a spectrum of aging rather than a binary of young versus old. People who reached their 50s had, by definition, survived everything that killed their peers. They'd made it through childhood's diseases. They'd avoided fatal accidents and violence. They'd survived plagues, if any, passed through during their lives. They'd either been lucky in health or constitutionally robust enough to withstand the accumulated insults of medieval life. In that sense, the elderly were a selected group, survivors whose genetics, circumstances, and fortune had carried them further than most. Aging bodies showed the wear of medieval life clearly. Arthritis was common, the result of decades of hard physical labor. Spines curved from years of bending and lifting. Joints ached. Teeth, subjected to coarse bread ground with stone mills that left grit in the flour, wore down to stumps or fell out entirely. Vision and hearing declined. The body's resilience decreased, making recovery from illness or injury slower and less certain. An infection that a younger person might shake off could prove fatal to someone whose constitution had weakened with age. Yet many older people remained active participants in their communities. A grandmother might help raise grandchildren, freeing younger adults for field work. An experienced craftsman could oversee apprentices, passing on decades of accumulated knowledge. An elderly woman might serve as midwife, her long experience making her invaluable to the community. Age brought certain forms of authority and respect. Experience mattered in a world where knowledge was transmitted orally and through practice rather than through books. The Church provided a structure that valued the elderly. Monasteries and convents accepted older people who wished to live out their years in religious community. Some entered religious life young, but others came later, after raising families or ending careers. These institutions provided care, stability, and purpose. They also served as de facto retirement homes for some, particularly among the nobility who could donate property or wealth to secure their place. Family care was the primary support system for elderly people who could no longer work. Adult children were expected to care for aging parents, providing food, shelter, and assistance. This was both cultural expectation and practical necessity. There was no social security system, no nursing homes in the modern sense. If your parents had raised you and worked to ensure your survival, you owed them care in their decline. Not every family fulfilled this obligation, but many did. Economic arrangements sometimes formalized these expectations. A farmer might transfer property to an adult son in exchange for an agreement that the son would provide for the parents for the rest of their lives. These contracts, recorded in manorial court rolls, specified what the elderly parents would receive: a room in the house, certain amounts of food and fuel, sometimes specific luxuries like a better cut of meat. When disputes arose, the courts might enforce these agreements, though enforcement was imperfect. The experience of old age varied by class. A wealthy noble could retire from active management of estates while still receiving income. They might maintain household servants who attended to their needs. They could afford physicians, though medical care's effectiveness remained limited. A poor peasant had fewer options. If they could no longer work and had no family to support them, they might depend on community charity or the church's alms. This precarity made poverty in old age particularly frightening. Not all elderly people were infirm. Some remained remarkably healthy and active into their 60s or even 70s. They might work at a reduced pace but still contribute meaningfully. Records mention elderly farmers still managing land, elderly merchants still conducting business, elderly craftspeople still producing work. The stereotype of helpless old age didn't describe everyone's experience. Some people aged more gracefully, maintaining function until near the end of life. Death in old age was often attributed to natural causes, the body simply wearing out. Medieval physicians might describe it as a final imbalance of the humors, a cooling and drying that accompanied age until vitality ebbed completely. Religious understanding framed it as the natural order, the completion of a life lived in anticipation of the next world. Death in old age, after a full life, was as good a death as one could hope for, better than the alternatives of accident, violence, or disease in youth. The elderly sometimes served as living memory for communities. They remembered events from decades past, creating oral histories that stretched back generations. They could recall when certain families had held certain lands, when disputes had arisen and how they'd been settled, when exceptional weather or harvests had occurred. In a largely illiterate society, these human repositories of memory served crucial functions. Medieval literature and art depicted old age with mixed attitudes. Sometimes elderly characters appeared as wise counselors whose advice proved valuable. Other times they appeared as figures of fun, their physical decline or irrelevance to current affairs made into jokes. Some religious texts praised the spiritual benefits of old age, suggesting that proximity to death encouraged proper focus on salvation. Some medical texts treated aging as a disease to be managed. The culture held multiple, sometimes contradictory views simultaneously. Preparing for death was appropriate at any age, but especially in old age. Elderly people often made detailed wills, distributing property and goods among heirs. They might make charitable bequests to churches or the poor, securing prayers for their souls. They arranged for masses to be said after their deaths. This practical and spiritual preparation helped them face mortality with some measure of control and dignity. The presence of elderly people in medieval society reminds us that the period wasn't uniformly brutal or short-lived. Yes, many died young. But some lived long, accumulated wisdom and property, raised multiple generations of descendants, and died surrounded by family. They proved that medieval life, while dangerous, wasn't inevitably short. The possibility of old age existed for those fortunate and hardy enough to reach it. When we see medieval illustrations showing multigenerational households, we shouldn't dismiss them as idealization. They reflected a reality that many people knew. Grandparents existed. Great-grandparents were rarer but not unheard of. The elderly were part of the community's fabric, visible and valued for what they contributed through experience and memory. They lived past the famous average, demonstrating that statistics, while useful, don't capture every individual reality. Some people lived long in the Middle Ages. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to matter. Medieval Europe stretched across 1,000 years and an entire continent, encompassing countless variations in culture, climate, economy, and political organization. To speak of medieval life expectancy as if it were uniform across all these differences is to oversimplify dramatically. A wealthy merchant in 13th century Florence lived a different life, with different risks and opportunities, than a peasant farmer in 10th century England or a monk in a 12th century French monastery. Understanding these variations helps us see the full complexity of medieval mortality. Class differences affected every aspect of life and death. At the top of society, nobility enjoyed better nutrition, more spacious housing, and freedom from the hardest physical labor. They ate more meat, more varied food, more calories. Their children had better chances of surviving infancy. When they fell ill, they could afford physicians. Yet they weren't immune to death's reach. Noble families still lost children to disease. Noble women still faced childbirth's dangers. And noble men faced warfare more directly, expected to lead troops in battle. Wealth provided advantages but not invulnerability. The clergy occupied a complicated position. Monks and nuns lived in communities that provided regular meals, relative safety, and freedom from certain dangers like warfare or childbirth. Some monasteries were wealthy and could provide excellent care for their members. But close living quarters spread disease easily. Strict dietary rules sometimes led to malnutrition. And some religious orders emphasized asceticism and self-denial that could shorten life. The experience varied enormously by order and house. Urban dwellers faced different risks than rural ones. Cities were exciting, economically dynamic places where money could be made and opportunities seized. But they were also crowded, with poor sanitation and rapid disease transmission. Plague hit cities especially hard. Water sources in cities were more likely to be contaminated. Urban violence was common. At the same time, cities had hospitals, physicians, and institutions of poor relief that rural areas lacked. A sick person in a city might have more resources available, even if their chances of getting sick were higher. Rural life provided cleaner air and water, generally. Villages were smaller, with more space between households. Agricultural work was hard, but it provided food security for most of the year. Disease spread more slowly in dispersed populations. But rural areas had fewer resources when crisis struck. A bad harvest could mean starvation. A serious injury might never be seen by a trained physician. Help, when needed, might be days away. Rural life offered stability in good times and vulnerability in bad ones. Geography mattered too. The Mediterranean climate was gentler than Northern Europe's harsh winters. Southern Europe could grow more diverse crops, providing better nutrition. But southern heat also encouraged certain diseases. Malaria was endemic in parts of Italy. Different regions faced different disease burdens. Someone in mosquito-infested marshlands faced different health threats than someone in cold mountain valleys. The century in which someone lived affected their chances considerably. The early medieval period, sometimes called the Dark Ages, was probably harder than later centuries. Population was lower, institutions weaker, trade less developed. The High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th through 13th centuries, saw population growth, economic expansion, agricultural improvements, and rising living standards. Then came the 14th century's crises, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, followed by the Black Death starting in 1347. Life expectancy probably rose during the High Middle Ages and plummeted during the 14th century's catastrophes. After the Black Death, the situation changed again in unexpected ways. With population reduced by half or more, survivors faced less competition for resources. Labor became valuable, giving peasants more bargaining power. Wages rose. Diet improved for those who survived. The 15th century saw recovery, though it looked different than before. Some historians argue that life expectancy for survivors actually improved after plague's initial devastation, a grim silver lining to catastrophic mortality. Warfare's frequency varied by region and era. Some areas saw near constant conflict. Others enjoyed long periods of relative peace. Living in a war-torn frontier zone meant different prospects than living in a stable kingdom's heartland. The same person might have vastly different life expectancies depending on whether they lived through war or peace. A peasant farmer might live to 70 in a peaceful era and die at 30 when armies marched through their region, burning fields and spreading disease. Famine struck with variable frequency and severity. A region with diverse agriculture and good trade connections could weather a bad harvest by importing food. An isolated region dependent on a single crop might face starvation when that crop failed. The Great Famine of the early 14th century hit northern Europe hard while sparing southern regions. Famine often preceded plague. Malnutrition weakened populations, making them more susceptible to disease when it arrived. Legal status shaped life chances profoundly. A free person could move, negotiate wages, and appeal to courts. A serf was bound to the land, owing labor services to a lord, with limited legal rights. Free status didn't guarantee prosperity, but it offered flexibility. Serfs who couldn't flee a plague-stricken manor died at higher rates than free people who could move to healthier areas. Legal structures either enabled or constrained responses to crisis. Gender created different patterns of risk. Women faced childbirth repeatedly, a major source of mortality. But women were also somewhat protected from warfare and some forms of violence. Male mortality peaked in young adulthood, when men were most likely to die in combat or violent disputes. Female mortality peaked during childbearing years. In old age, women sometimes outnumbered men, having survived the reproductive years that killed so many of their peers. Occupational risk varied enormously. A shepherd in the hills faced different dangers than a miner underground, or a sailor at sea. Some crafts were relatively safe. A scribe working with pen and parchment faced mainly sedentary health issues. Others were deadly. Mining, fishing, and construction all had high mortality rates. Career choice, often determined by birth rather than preference, significantly affected how long someone might expect to live. Even within a single community, individual circumstances created different outcomes. Two brothers born a year apart might have vastly different lives, one surviving childhood diseases that killed the other, one suffering an accident the other avoided, one living to old age while the other died in youth. Luck, constitution, and countless small decisions created diverging paths. Life expectancy describes populations, but individuals lived individual lives, each unique. Understanding all these variations doesn't mean we can't say anything general about medieval life expectancy. It means we must be cautious and specific. We should say, a peasant in 13th century England who survived to age 20 might expect, rather than making sweeping claims about medieval people. The Middle Ages contained multitudes, rich and poor, urban and rural, healthy and sick, lucky and unlucky. Each lived in their particular circumstances, which shaped their chances of survival in specific ways. The commonality across all these variations was uncertainty. Rich or poor, north or south, 10th century or 15th, everyone lived with the knowledge that death could come suddenly. Plague didn't respect class boundaries perfectly. Accidents happened to careful people. Childbirth killed nobles and peasants alike. The degree of risk varied, but risk itself was universal. Medieval people from every background shared this awareness of mortality's presence, and they built their cultures and worldviews with this knowledge woven through them. The candle has burned low. Outside the medieval hall we imagined at the start, dawn might be approaching, or perhaps night is deepening further. Time moved differently then, measured by church bells and seasons rather than clocks, marked by the passage of lives rather than years on a calendar. We've walked through that world, seen its dangers and its survivors, understood something of what those famous numbers really mean. Medieval life expectancy was low by our standards, yes. But behind that average lived real people whose lives were more complex than any statistic can capture. Children who survived infancy often lived to see their own grandchildren. Workers aged by labor still found ways to contribute as elders. Communities contained young and old, the fortunate and the unfortunate, those whose time was short and those who saw many decades pass. The medieval world was dangerous. Disease struck without understanding of its cause. Accidents happened without safety regulations to prevent them. Violence flared more easily than we're used to. But people adapted, survived, and even thrived within these constraints. They raised families, built communities, created art and architecture that still stands. They loved, worked, argued, celebrated, mourned, and continued. They were fully human, living lives as rich and meaningful as any, even if those lives were often shorter than we now expect. Understanding medieval life expectancy helps us appreciate our own age's achievements. Modern medicine, public health, and safety measures have transformed human survival. We've pushed back infant mortality, controlled infectious diseases, made childbirth far safer. These are genuine accomplishments worth celebrating. But understanding medieval life expectancy also reminds us that numbers alone don't tell the whole story. Behind every statistic are individual lives, each one unique, each one valuable. Perhaps most importantly, seeing medieval mortality clearly helps us recognize that our ancestors weren't fundamentally different from us. They wanted to live, to protect their children, to see their families thrive. They faced their world's dangers with the tools and knowledge they had. They weren't primitive or foolish or doomed. They were people, doing their best, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, always human. So rest now. Let these stories of medieval lives settle in your mind. Remember that the 30-year life expectancy is true but incomplete. Remember the children who survived, the adults who aged, the elderly who accumulated wisdom. Remember that history is made of individual lives, not just averages, and that every person who lived through those centuries experienced their own unique journey from birth to death, filled with moments both ordinary and extraordinary. The past is a foreign country, but its inhabitants were people we'd recognize, people who'd understand love and loss, hope and fear, joy and sorrow. They lived in a world very different from ours, but they lived fully as circumstances allowed. And some of them, the fortunate ones, lived long enough to see the world change, to tell stories of their youth to grandchildren, to close their eyes at the end having witnessed decades of life. Not everyone, but enough to remind us that medieval life, for all its hardships, held the possibility of age and experience and memory stretching across the years. Sleep well, knowing the past is more complicated and more human than simple numbers suggest.